conventions? Painters, musicians, writers, hangers-on, models, advanced young people, anybody who is openly at outs with the conventions and belongs to nowhere particularly. They are often young fellows down from the university, and girls who are living their own lives, as they say. All loose, said Gerald. Birkin could see his curiosity roused. In one way, most bound in another, for all their shockingness, all on one note. He looked at Gerald and saw how his blue eyes were lit up with a little flame of curious desire. He saw, too, how good-looking he was. Gerald was attractive. His blood seemed fluid and electric. His blue eyes burned with a keen, yet cold light. There was a certain beauty, a beautiful passivity in all his body, his molding. We might see something of each other. I am in London for 2 or 3 days, said Gerald. Yes, said Birkin. I don't want to go to the theater or the music hall. You'd better come round to the flat and see what you can make of Halliday and his crowd. Thanks. I should like to, laughed Gerald. What are you doing tonight? I promised to meet Halliday at the Pompadour. It's a bad place, but there is nowhere else. Where is it? Asked Gerald. Piccadilly Circus. Oh, yes. Well, shall I come round there? By all means, it might amuse you. The evening was falling. They had passed Bedford. Birkin watched the country and was filled with a sort of hopelessness. He always felt this on approaching London. His dislike of mankind, of the mass of mankind, amounted almost to an illness, where the quiet-colored end of evening smiles miles and miles. He was murmuring to himself, like a man condemned to death. Gerald, who was very subtly alert, wary in all his senses, leaned forward and asked smilingly, "What were you saying?" Birkin glanced at him, laughed, and repeated, "Where the quiet-colored end of evening smiles miles and miles, over pastures where the something sheep half asleep." Gerald also looked now at the country, and Birkin, who, for some reason, was now tired and dispirited, said to him, "I always feel doomed when the train is running into London. I feel such a despair, so hopeless, as if it were the end of the world." "Really?" said Gerald. "And does the end of the world frighten you?" Birkin lifted his shoulders in a slow shrug. "I don't know," he said. "It does while it hangs imminent and doesn't fall. But people give me a bad feeling, very bad." There was a roused, glad smile in Gerald's eyes. "Do they?" he said, and he watched the other man critically. In a few minutes the train was running through the disgrace of outspread London. Everybody in the carriage was on the alert, waiting to escape. At last they were under the huge arch of the station, in the tremendous shadow of the town. Birkin shut himself together. He was in now. The two men went together in a taxicab. "Don't you feel like one of the damned?" asked Birkin, as they sat in a little, swiftly running enclosure and watched the hideous great street. "No," laughed Gerald. "It is real death," said Birkin.
6. Crème de menthe.
They met again in the cafe several hours later. Gerald went through the push doors into the large, lofty room where the faces and heads of the drinkers showed dimly through the haze of smoke, reflected more dimly, and repeated ad infinitum in the great mirrors on the walls, so that one seemed to enter a vague, dim world of shadowy drinkers humming within an atmosphere of blue tobacco smoke. There was, however, the red plush of the seats to give substance within the bubble of pleasure. Gerald moved in his slow, observant, glistening attentive motion down between the tables and the people whose shadowy faces looked up as he passed. He seemed to be entering in some strange element, passing into an illuminated new region among a host of licentious souls. He was pleased and entertained. He looked over all the dim, evanescent, strangely illuminated faces that bent across the tables. Then he saw Birkin rise and signal to him. At Birkin's table was a girl with dark, soft, fluffy hair cut short in the artist fashion, hanging level and full almost like the Egyptian princesses. She was small and delicately made, with warm coloring and large, dark hostile eyes. There was a delicacy, almost a beauty in all her form, and at the same time a certain attractive grossness of spirit that made a little spark leap instantly alight in Gerald's eyes. Birkin, who looked muted, unreal, his presence left out, introduced her as Miss Darrington. She gave her hand with a sudden, unwilling movement, looking all the while at Gerald with a dark, exposed stare. A glow came over him as he sat down. The waiter appeared. Gerald glanced at the glasses of the other two. Birkin was drinking something green. Miss Darrington had a small liqueur glass that was empty save for a tiny drop. "Won't you have some more?" "Brandy," she said, sipping her last drop and putting down the glass. The waiter disappeared. "No," she said to Birkin. "He doesn't know I'm back. He'll be terrified when he sees me here." She spoke her R's like W's, lisping with a slightly babyish pronunciation which was at once affected and true to her character. Her voice was dull and toneless. "Where is he then?" asked Birkin. "He's doing a private show at Lady Snellgrove's," said the girl. "Warren's is there too." There was a pause. "Well, then," said Birkin, in a dispassionate, protective manner, "what do you intend to do?" The girl paused sullenly. She hated the question. "I don't intend to do anything," she replied. "I shall look for some sittings tomorrow." "Who shall you go to?" asked Birkin. "I shall go to Bentley's first. But I believe he's angry with me for running away." "That is from the Madonna?"
Yes.
"And then if he doesn't want me, I know I can get work with Carmarthen." "Carmarthen?" "Lord Carmarthen. He does photographs. Chiffon and shoulders."
Yes.
"But he's awfully decent." There was a pause. "And what are you going to do about Julius?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I shall just ignore him." "You've done with him altogether?" But she turned aside her face sullenly and did not answer the question. Another young man came hurrying up to the table. "Hello, Birkin." "Hello, Poosum. When did you come back?" he said eagerly. "Today." "Does Halliday know?" "I don't know. I don't care either." "Haha, the wind still sits in that quarter, does it? Do you mind if I come over to this table?" "I'm talking to Rupert, do you mind?" she replied, coolly and yet appealingly, like a child. Open confession. Good for the soul. Said the young man. "Well, so long." And giving a sharp look at Birkin and at Gerald, the young man moved off, with a swing of his coat skirts. All this time Gerald had been completely ignored, and yet he felt that the girl was physically aware of his proximity. He waited, listened, and tried to piece together the conversation. "Are you staying at the flat?" the girl asked of Birkin. "For 3 days," replied Birkin. "And you?" "I don't know yet. I can always go to Bertha's." There was a silence. Suddenly the girl turned to Gerald and said, in a rather formal, polite voice, with the distant manner of a woman who accepts her position as a social inferior, yet assumes intimate camaraderie with the male she addresses. "Do you know London well?" "I can hardly say," he laughed. "I've been up a good many times, but I was never in this place before." "You're not an artist, then?" she said, in a tone that placed him an outsider. "No," he replied. "He's a soldier and an explorer and a Napoleon of industry," said Birkin, giving Gerald his credentials for Bohemia. "Are you a soldier?" asked the girl, with a cold yet lively curiosity. "No, I resigned my commission," said Gerald, "some years ago." "He was in the last war," said Birkin. "Were you really?" said the girl. "And then he explored the Amazon," said Birkin, "and now he is ruling over coal mines." The girl looked at Gerald with steady, calm curiosity. He laughed, hearing himself described. He felt proud too, full of male strength. His blue, keen eyes were lit up with laughter. His ruddy face, with its sharp fair hair, was full of satisfaction and glowing with life. He piqued her. "How long are you staying?" she asked him. "A day or 2, he replied. "But there is no particular hurry." Still she stared into his face with that slow, full gaze which was so curious and so exciting to him. He was acutely and delightfully conscious of himself, of his own attractiveness. He felt full of strength, able to give off a sort of electric power. And he was aware of her dark, hot-looking eyes upon him. She had beautiful eyes, dark, fully opened, hot, naked in their looking at him. And on them there seemed to float a film of disintegration, a sort of misery and sullenness, like oil on water. She wore no hat in the heated cafe, Her loose, simple jumper was strung on a string round her neck, but it was made of rich peach-colored crepe de chine that hung heavily and softly from her young throat and her slender wrists. Her appearance was simple and complete, really beautiful, because of her regularity and form, her soft dark hair falling full and level on either side of her head, her straight, small, softened features, Egyptian in the slight fullness of their curves, her slender neck and the simple, rich-colored smock hanging on her slender shoulders. She was very still, almost null, in her manner, apart and watchful. She appealed to Gerald strongly. He felt an awful, enjoyable power over her, an instinctive cherishing very near to cruelty, for she was a victim. He felt that she was in his power, and he was generous. The electricity was turgid and voluptuously rich in his limbs. He would be able to destroy her utterly in the strength of his discharge, but she was waiting in her separation given. They talked banalities for some time. Suddenly Birkin said, "There's Julius," and he half rose to his feet, motioning to the newcomer. The girl, with a curious, almost evil motion, looked round over her shoulder without moving her body. Gerald watched her dark, soft hair swing over her ears. He felt her watching intensely the man who was approaching, so he looked too. He saw a pale, full-built young man with rather long, solid fair hair hanging from under his black hat, moving cumbrously down the room, his face lit up with a smile at once naive and warm and vapid. He approached towards Birkin with a haste of welcome. It was not till he was quite close that he perceived the girl. He recoiled, went pale, and said, in a high squealing voice, "Husam, what are you doing here?" The cafe looked up like animals when they hear a cry. Halliday hung motionless, an almost imbecile smile flickering palely on his face. The girl only stared at him with a black look in which flared an unfathomable hell of knowledge and a certain impotence. She was limited by him. "Why have you come back?" repeated Halliday in the same high, hysterical voice. "I told you not to come back." The girl did not answer, only stared in the same viscous, heavy fashion, straight at him as he stood recoiled, as if for safety, against the next table. "You know you wanted her to come back. Come and sit down," said Birkin to him. "No, I didn't want her to come back, and I told her not to come back. What have you come for, Husam?" "For nothing from you," she said in a heavy voice of resentment. "Then why have you come back at all?" cried Halliday, his voice rising to a kind of squeal. "She comes as she likes," said Birkin. "Are you going to sit down, or are you not?" "No, I won't sit down with Husam," cried Halliday. "I won't hurt you, you needn't be afraid," she said to him, very curtly and yet with a sort of protectiveness towards him in her voice. Halliday came and sat at the table, putting his hand on his heart and crying, "Oh, it's given me such a turn. Husam, I wish you wouldn't do these things. Why did you come back?" "Not for anything from you," she repeated. "You've said that before," he cried in a high voice. She turned completely away from him, to Gerald Critch, whose eyes were shining with a subtle amusement. "Were you ever viewy much afraid of the savages?" she asked in her calm, dull childish voice. "No, never very much afraid. On the whole, they're harmless. They're not born yet, you can't feel really afraid of them. You know you can manage them." "Do you really? Aren't they very fierce?" "Not very. There aren't many fierce things, as a matter of fact. There aren't many things, neither people nor animals, that have it in them to be really dangerous." "Except in herds," interrupted Birkin. "Aren't there really?" she said. "Oh, I thought savages were all so dangerous. They'd have your life before you could look round." "Did you?" he laughed. "They are overrated, savages. They're too much like other people, not exciting after the first acquaintance." "Oh, it's not so very wonderfully brave then, to be an explorer?"
No.
"It's more a question of hardships than of terrors."
Oh.
"And weren't you ever afraid? In my life? I don't know. Yes, I'm afraid of some things, of being shut up, locked up anywhere, or being fastened. I'm afraid of being bound hand and foot." She looked at him steadily with her dark eyes, that rested on him and roused him so deeply that it left his upper self quite calm. It was rather delicious to feel her drawing his self-revelations from him, as from the very innermost dark marrow of his body. She wanted to know, and her dark eyes seemed to be looking through into his naked organism. He felt she was compelled to him, she was fated to come into contact with him, must have the seeing him and knowing him, and this roused a curious exultance. Also he felt she must relinquish herself into his hands and be subject to him. She was so profane, slave-like, watching him, absorbed by him. It was not that she was interested in what he said. She was absorbed by his self-revelation, by him. She wanted the secret of him, the experience of his male being. Gerald's face was lit up with an uncanny smile, full of light and rousedness, yet unconscious. He sat with his arms on the table, his sun-browned, rather sinister hands, that were animal and yet very shapely and attractive, pushed forward towards her. And they fascinated her. And she knew. She watched her own fascination. Other men had come to the table to talk with Birkin and Halliday. Gerald said in a low voice, apart, to Pusum, "Where have you come back from?" "From the country," replied Pusum, in a very low, yet fully resonant voice. Her face closed hard. Continually she glanced at Halliday, and then a black flare came over her eyes. The heavy, fair young man ignored her completely. He was really afraid of her. For some moments, she would be unaware of Gerald. He had not conquered her yet. "And what has Halliday to do with it?" he asked, his voice still muted. She would not answer for some seconds. Then she said unwillingly, "He made me go and live with him, and now he wants to throw me over. And yet he won't let me go to anybody else. He wants me to live hidden in the country. And then he says I persecute him, that he can't get rid of me." "Doesn't know his own mind," said Gerald. "He hasn't any mind, so he can't know it," she said. "He waits for what somebody tells him to do. He never does anything he wants to do himself because he doesn't know what he wants. He's a perfect baby." Gerald looked at Halliday for some moments, watching the soft, rather degenerate face of the young man. Its very softness was an attraction. It was a soft, warm, corrupt nature into which one might plunge with gratification. "But he has no hold over you, has he?" Gerald asked. "You see, he made me go and live with him when I didn't want to," she replied. "He came and cried to me, tears you never saw so many, saying he couldn't bear it unless I went back to him. And he wouldn't go away. He would have stayed forever. He made me go back. Then every time he behaves in this fashion. And now I'm going to have a baby. He wants to give me £100 and send me into the country so that he would never see me nor hear of me again. But I'm not going to do it after." A queer look came over Gerald's face. "Are you going to have a child?" he asked, incredulous. It seemed to look at her impossible. She was so young and so far in spirit from any childbearing. She looked full into his face, and her dark, inchoate eyes had now a furtive look, and a look of a knowledge of evil. Dark and indomitable, a flame ran secretly to his heart. "Yes," she said. "Isn't it beastly? Don't you want it?" he asked. "I don't," she replied emphatically. "But," he said, "how long have you known?" 10 weeks, she said. All the time she kept her dark, inchoate eyes full upon him. He remained silent, thinking. Then, switching off and becoming cold, he asked, in a voice full of considerate kindness, "Is there anything we can eat here? Is there anything you would like?" "Yes," she said. "I should adore some oysters." "All right," he said. "We'll have oysters." And he beckoned to the waiter. Halliday took no notice until the little plate was set before her. Then suddenly he cried, "Pusum, you can't eat oysters when you're drinking brandy." "What has it got to do with you?" she asked. "Nothing, nothing," he cried. "But you can't eat oysters when you're drinking brandy." "I'm not drinking brandy," she replied, and she sprinkled the last drops of her liqueur over his face. He gave an odd squeal. She sat looking at him, as if indifferent. "Pusum, why do you do that?" he cried in panic. He gave Gerald the impression that he was terrified of her and that he loved his terror. He seemed to relish his own horror and hatred of her, turn it over and extract every flavor from it, in real panic. Gerald thought him a strange fool, and yet piquant. "But Pusum," said another man, in a very small, quick-eaten voice, "you promised not to hurt him." "I haven't hurt him," she answered. "What will you drink?" the young man asked. He was dark and smooth-skinned, and full of a stealthy vigor. "I don't like porter, Maxim," she replied. "You must ask for champagne," came the whispering, gentlemanly voice of the other. Gerald suddenly realized that this was a hint to him. "Shall we have champagne?" he asked, laughing. "Yes, please, DWY," she lisped childishly. Gerald watched her eating the oysters. She was delicate and finicking in her eating. Her fingers were fine and seemed very sensitive in the tips, so she put her food apart with fine, small motions. She ate carefully, delicately. It pleased him very much to see her, and it irritated Birkin. They were all drinking champagne. Maxim, the prim young Russian with the smooth, warm-colored face and black, oiled hair, was the only one who seemed to be perfectly calm and sober. Birkin was white and abstract, unnatural. Gerald was smiling with a constant bright, amused, cold light in his eyes, leaning a little protectively towards the Pusum, who was very handsome and soft, unfolded like some red lotus in dreadful flowering nakedness, vainglorious now, flushed with wine and with the excitement of men. Halliday looked foolish. One glass of wine was enough to make him drunk and giggling. Yet there was always a pleasant, warm naivete about him that made him attractive. "I'm not afraid of anything except black beetles," said the Pusum, looking up suddenly and staring with her black eyes, on which there seemed an unseeing film of flame, fully upon Gerald. He laughed dangerously from the blood. Her childish speech caressed his nerves, and her burning, filmed eyes, turned now full upon him, oblivious of all her antecedents, gave him a sort of license. "I'm not," she protested. "I'm not afraid of other things. But black beetles, ugh," she shuddered convulsively, as if the very thought were too much to bear. "Do you mean," said Gerald, with the punctiliousness of a man who has been drinking, "that you are afraid of the sight of a black beetle, or you are afraid of a black beetle biting you, or doing you some harm?" "Do they bite?" cried the girl. "How perfectly loathsome!" exclaimed Halliday. "I don't know," replied Gerald, looking round the table. "Do black beetles bite? But that isn't the point. Are you afraid of their biting, or is it a metaphysical antipathy?" The girl was looking full upon him all the time with inchoate eyes. "Oh, I think they're beastly, they're horrid," she cried. "If I see one, it gives me the creeps all over. If one were to crawl on me, I'm sure I should die. I'm sure I should." "I hope not," whispered the young Russian. "I'm sure I should, Maxim," she asseverated. "Then one won't crawl on you," said Gerald, smiling and knowing. In some strange way he understood her. "It's metaphysical, as Gerald says," Birkin stated. There was a little pause of uneasiness. "And are you afraid of nothing else, Pusum?" asked the young Russian, in his quick, hushed, elegant manner. "Not really," she said. "I am afraid of some things, but not really the same. I'm not afraid of blood." "Not afraid of blood," exclaimed a young man with a thick, pale, jeering face, who had just come to the table and was drinking whiskey. The Pusum turned on him a sulky look of dislike, low and ugly. "Aren't you really afraid of blood?" the other persisted, a sneer all over his face. "No, I'm not," she retorted. "Why, have you ever seen blood, except in a dentist's spittoon?" jeered the young man. "I wasn't speaking to you," she replied rather superbly. "You can answer me, can't you?" he said. For reply, she suddenly jabbed a knife across his thick, pale hand. He started up with a vulgar curse. "Shows what you are," said the Pusum in contempt. "Curse you," said the young man, standing by the table and looking down at her with acrid malevolence. "Stop that," said Gerald, in quick, instinctive command. The young man stood looking down at her with sardonic contempt, a cowed, self-conscious look on his thick, pale face. The blood began to flow from his hand. "Oh, how horrible! Take it away," squealed Halliday, turning green and averting his face. "Do you feel ill?" asked the sardonic young man, in some concern. Do you feel ill, Julius? Garn, it's nothing, man. Don't give her the pleasure of letting her think she's performed a feat. Don't give her the satisfaction, man. It's just what she wants. Oh, squealed Halliday. He's going to cat Maxim, said the Pusum warningly. The suave young Russian rose and took Halliday by the arm, leading him away. Birkin, white and diminished, looked on as if he were displeased. The wounded, sardonic young man moved away, ignoring his bleeding hand in the most conspicuous fashion. He's an awful coward, really, said the Pusum to Gerald. He's got such an influence over Julius. Who is he? Asked Gerald. He's a Jew, really. I can't bear him. Well, he's quite unimportant. But what's wrong with Halliday? Julius is the most awful coward you've ever seen, she cried. He always faints if I lift a knife. He's terrified of me. Said Gerald. They're all afraid of me, she said. Only the Jew thinks he's going to show his courage. But he's the biggest coward of them all, really, because he's afraid what people will think about him, and Julius doesn't care about that. They've a lot of valor between them, said Gerald good-humoredly. The Pusum looked at him with a slow smile. She was very handsome, flushed, and confident in dreadful knowledge. 2 little points of light glinted on Gerald's eyes. Why do they call you Pusum? Because you're like a cat? He asked her. I expect so, she said. The smile grew more intense on his face. You are a young female panther. Oh God, Gerald, said Birkin, in some disgust. They both looked uneasily at Birkin. You're silent tonight, Rupert, she said to him, with a slight insolence, being safe with the other man. Halliday was coming back, looking forlorn and sick. Pusum, he said, I wish you wouldn't do these things. Oh. He sank in his chair with a groan. You'd better go home, she said to him. I will go home, he said. But won't you all come along? Won't you come round to the flat? He said to Gerald. I should be so glad if you would. Do, that'll be splendid. I say. He looked round for a waiter. Get me a taxi. Then he groaned again. Oh, I do feel perfectly ghastly. Pusum, you see what you do to me. Then why are you such an idiot? She said with sullen calm. But I'm not an idiot. Oh, how awful. Do come, everybody, it will be so splendid. Pusum, you're coming.
What?
Oh, but you must come. Yes, you must.
What?
Oh, my dear girl, don't make a fuss now. I feel perfectly. Oh, it's so ghastly, ho.
Yeah.
Oh, you know you can't drink, she said to him coldly. I tell you it isn't drink. It's your disgusting behavior. Pusum, it's nothing else. Oh, how awful.
Libidniko, doletus gospo.
He's only drunk 1 glass. Only 1 glass, came the rapid, hushed voice of the young Russian. They all moved off to the door. The girl kept near to Gerald and seemed to be at one in her motion with him. He was aware of this and filled with demon satisfaction that his motion held good for 2. He held her in the hollow of his will, and she was soft, secret, invisible in her stirring there. They crowded 5 of them into the taxicab. Halliday lurched in first and dropped into his seat against the other window. Then the Pusum took her place, and Gerald sat next to her. They heard the young Russian giving orders to the driver. Then they were all seated in the dark, crowded close together, Halliday groaning and leaning out of the window. They felt the swift, muffled motion of the car. The Pusum sat near to Gerald, and she seemed to become soft, subtly to infuse herself into his bones, as if she were passing into him in a black, electric flow, her being suffused into his veins like a magnetic darkness and concentrated at the base of his spine like a fearful source of power. Meanwhile, her voice sounded out reedy and nonchalant as she talked indifferently with Birkin and with Maxim. Between her and Gerald was this silence and this black, electric comprehension in the darkness. Then she found his hand and grasped it in her own firm, small clasp. It was so utterly dark and yet such a naked statement that rapid vibrations ran through his blood and over his brain. He was no longer responsible. Still her voice rang on like a bell, tinged with a tone of mockery. And as she swung her head, her fine mane of hair just swept his face, and all his nerves were on fire, as with a subtle friction of electricity. But the great center of his force held steady, a magnificent pride to him, at the base of his spine. They arrived at a large block of buildings, went up in a lift, and presently a door was being opened for them by a Hindu. Gerald looked in surprise, wondering if he were a gentleman, one of the Hindus down from Oxford, perhaps. But no, he was the manservant. "Make tea, Hassan," said Halliday. "There is a room for me," said Birkin. To both of which questions the man grinned and murmured. He made Gerald uncertain, because, being tall and slender and reticent, he looked like a gentleman. "Who is your servant?" he asked of Halliday. "He looks a swell." "Oh yes, that's because he's dressed in another man's clothes. He's anything but a swell, really. We found him in the road, starving. So I took him here and another man gave him clothes. He's anything but what he seems to be. His only advantage is that he can't speak English and can't understand it, so he's perfectly safe." "He's very dirty," said the young Russian swiftly and silently. Directly, the man appeared in the doorway. "What is it?" said Halliday. The Hindu grinned and murmured shyly, "Want to speak to master." Gerald watched curiously. The fellow in the doorway was good-looking and clean-limbed. His bearing was calm. He looked elegant, aristocratic. Yet he was half a savage, grinning foolishly. Halliday went out into the corridor to speak with him. "What?" They heard his voice.
What?
"What do you say? Tell me again."
What?
"Want money? Want more money? But what do you want money for?" There was the confused sound of the Hindus talking. Then Halliday appeared in the room, smiling also foolishly, and saying, "He says he wants money to buy underclothing. Can anybody lend me a shilling?" "Oh, thanks, a shilling will do to buy all the underclothes he wants." He took the money from Gerald and went out into the passage again, where they heard him saying, "You can't want more money. You had 3 and 6 yesterday. You mustn't ask for any more. Bring the tea in quickly." Gerald looked round the room. It was an ordinary London sitting room in a flat, evidently taken furnished, rather common and ugly. But there were several Negro statues, wood carvings from West Africa, strange and disturbing. The carved Negroes looked almost like the fetus of a human being. One was a woman sitting naked in a strange posture and looking tortured, her abdomen stuck out. The young Russian explained that she was sitting in childbirth, clutching the ends of the band that hung from her neck, one in each hand, so that she could bear down and help labor. The strange, transfixed, rudimentary face of the woman again reminded Gerald of a fetus. It was also rather wonderful, conveying the suggestion of the extreme of physical sensation beyond the limits of mental consciousness. "Aren't they rather obscene?" he asked, disapproving. "I don't know," murmured the other rapidly. "I have never defined the obscene. I think they are very good." Gerald turned away. There were 1 or 2 new pictures in the room, in the futurist manner. There was a large piano, and these, with some ordinary London lodging house furniture of the better sort, completed the whole. The Pusum had taken off her hat and coat and was seated on the sofa. She was evidently quite at home in the house, but uncertain, suspended. She did not quite know her position. Her alliance for the time being was with Gerald, and she did not know how far this was admitted by any of the men. She was considering how she should carry off the situation. She was determined to have her experience. Now, at this 11th hour, she was not to be balked. Her face was flushed as with battle. Her eye was brooding but inevitable. The man came in with tea and a bottle of Kummel. He set the tray on a little table before the couch. "Pusum," said Halliday, "pour out the tea." She did not move. "Won't you do it?" Halliday repeated, in a state of nervous apprehension. "I've not come back here as it was before," she said. "I only came because the others wanted me to, not for your sake. My dear Pusum, you know you are your own mistress. I don't want you to do anything but use the flat for your own convenience, you know it. I've told you so many times." She did not reply, but silently, reservedly reached for the teapot. They all sat round and drank tea. Gerald could feel the electric connection between him and her so strongly, as she sat there quiet and withheld, that another set of conditions altogether had come to pass. Her silence, and her immutability perplexed him. How was he going to come to her? And yet he felt it quite inevitable. He trusted completely to the current that held them. His perplexity was only superficial. New conditions reigned. The old were surpassed. Here one did as one was possessed to do, no matter what it was. Birkin rose. It was nearly 1 o'clock. "I'm going to bed," he said. "Gerald, I'll ring you up in the morning at your place, or you ring me up here." "Right," said Gerald, and Birkin went out. When he was well gone, Halliday said in a stimulated voice to Gerald, "I say, won't you stay here?" "Oh, do. You can't put everybody up," said Gerald. "Oh, but I can perfectly. There are 3 more beds besides mine. Do stay, won't you? Everything is quite ready. There is always somebody here. I always put people up. I love having the house crowded." "But there are only 2 rooms," said the Pusum in a cold, hostile voice. "Now Rupert's here." "I know there are only 2 rooms," said Halliday in his odd, high way of speaking. "But what does that matter?" He was smiling rather foolishly, and he spoke eagerly, with an insinuating determination. "Julius and I will share 1 room," said the Russian in his discreet, precise voice. Halliday and he were friends since Eton. "It's very simple," said Gerald, rising and pressing back his arms, stretching himself. Then he went again to look at one of the pictures. Every one of his limbs was turgid with electric force, and his back was tense like a tiger's, with slumbering fire. He was very proud. The Pusum rose. She gave a black look at Halliday, black and deadly, which brought the rather foolishly pleased smile to that young man's face. Then she went out of the room, with a cold good night to them all generally. There was a brief interval. They heard a door close. Then Maxim said, in his refined voice, "That's all right." He looked significantly at Gerald and said again with a silent nod, "That's all right. You're all right." Gerald looked at the smooth, ruddy, comely face and at the strange, significant eyes, and it seemed as if the voice of the young Russian, so small and perfect, sounded in the blood rather than in the air. "I'm all right then," said Gerald. "Yes, yes, you're all right," said the Russian. Halliday continued to smile and to say nothing. Suddenly the Pusum appeared again in the door, her small, childish face looking sullen and vindictive. "I know you want to catch me out," came her cold, rather resonant voice. "But I don't care. I don't care how much you catch me out." She turned and was gone again. She had been wearing a loose dressing gown of purple silk tied round her waist. She looked so small and childish and vulnerable, almost pitiful. And yet the black looks of her eyes made Gerald feel drowned in some potent darkness that almost frightened him. The men lit another cigarette and talked casually. 7. Fetish. In the morning, Gerald woke late. He had slept heavily. Pusum was still asleep, sleeping childishly and pathetically. There was something small and curled up and defenseless about her that roused an unsatisfied flame of passion in the young man's blood, a devouring, avid pity. He looked at her again, but it would be too cruel to wake her. He subdued himself and went away. Hearing voices coming from the sitting room, Halliday talking to Lebednikov, he went to the door and glanced in. He had on a silk wrap of a beautiful bluish color with an amethyst hem. To his surprise, he saw the 2 young men by the fire, stark naked. Halliday looked up, rather pleased.
"Good morning," he said.
"Oh, did you want towels?" And stark naked, he went out into the hall, striding a strange, white figure between the unliving furniture. He came back with the towels and took his former position, crouching seated before the fire on the fender. "Don't you love to feel the fire on your skin?" he said. "It is rather pleasant," said Gerald. "How perfectly splendid it must be to be in a climate where one could do without clothing altogether," said Halliday. "Yes," said Gerald. "If there weren't so many things that sting and bite." "That's a disadvantage," murmured Maxim. Gerald looked at him, and with a slight revulsion saw the human animal, golden-skinned and bare, somehow humiliating. Halliday was different. He had a rather heavy, slack, broken beauty, white and firm. He was like a Christ in a Pieta. The animal was not there at all, only the heavy, broken beauty. And Gerald realized how Halliday's eyes were beautiful too, so blue and warm and confused, broken also in their expression. The fire glow fell on his heavy, rather bowed shoulders. He sat slackly crouched on the fender. His face was uplifted, weak, perhaps slightly disintegrate, and yet with a moving beauty of its own. "Of course," said Maxim, "you've been in hot countries where the people go about naked." "Oh, really?" exclaimed Halliday. "Where?" "South America, Amazon," said Gerald. "Oh, but how perfectly splendid. It's one of the things I want most to do, to live from day to day without ever putting on any sort of clothing whatever. If I could do that, I should feel I had lived." "But why?" said Gerald. "I can't see that it makes so much difference." "Oh, I think it would be perfectly splendid. I'm sure life would be entirely another thing, entirely different and perfectly wonderful." "But why?" asked Gerald. "Why should it?" "Oh, one would feel things instead of merely looking at them. I should feel the air move against me and feel the things I touched instead of having only to look at them. I'm sure life is all wrong because it has become much too visual. We can neither hear nor feel nor understand. We can only see. I'm sure that is entirely wrong." "Yes, that is true. That is true," said the Russian. Gerald glanced at him and saw him, his suave, golden-colored body with the black hair growing fine and freely, like tendrils, and his limbs like smooth plant stems. He was so healthy and well-made. Why did he make one ashamed? Why did one feel repelled? Why should Gerald even dislike it? Why did it seem to him to detract from his own dignity? Was that all a human being amounted to? So uninspired, thought Gerald. Buchan suddenly appeared in the doorway, in white pajamas and wet hair, and a towel over his arm. He was aloof and white, and somehow evanescent. "There's the bathroom now if you want it," he said generally, and was going away again, when Gerald called. "I say, Rupert."
"What?"
The single white figure appeared again, a presence in the room. "What do you think of that figure there?" "I want to know," Gerald asked. Buchan, white and strangely ghostly, went over to the carved figure of the Negro woman in labor. Her nude, protuberant body crouched in a strange, clutching posture, her hands gripping the ends of the band, above her breast. "It is art," said Buchan. "Very beautiful, it's very beautiful," said the Russian. They all drew near to look. Gerald looked at the group of men, the Russian golden and like a water plant, Halliday tall and heavily, brokenly beautiful, Buchan very white and indefinite, not to be assigned, as he looked closely at the carven woman. Strangely elated, Gerald also lifted his eyes to the face of the wooden figure, and his heart contracted. He saw vividly with his spirit the gray, forward-stretching face of the Negro woman, African and tense, abstracted in utter physical stress. It was a terrible face, void, peaked, abstracted almost into meaninglessness by the weight of sensation beneath. He saw the pussum in it. As in a dream, he knew her. "Why is it art?" Gerald asked, shocked, resentful. "It conveys a complete truth," said Buchan. "It contains the whole truth of that state, whatever you feel about it." "But you can't call it high art," said Gerald. "High. There are centuries and hundreds of centuries of development in a straight line behind that carving. It is an awful pitch of culture, of a definite sort." "What culture?" Gerald asked in opposition. He hated the sheer African thing. "Pure culture and sensation. Culture in the physical consciousness, really ultimate physical consciousness, mindless, utterly sensual. It is so sensual as to be final, supreme." But Gerald resented it. He wanted to keep certain illusions, certain ideas like clothing. "You like the wrong things, Rupert," he said. "Things against yourself." "Oh, I know. This isn't everything," Buchan replied, moving away. When Gerald went back to his room from the bath, he also carried his clothes. He was so conventional at home that when he was really away and on the loose as now, he enjoyed nothing so much as full outrageousness. So he strode with his blue silk wrap over his arm and felt defiant. The pussum lay in her bed, motionless, her round, dark eyes like black, unhappy pools. He could only see the black, bottomless pools of her eyes. Perhaps she suffered. The sensation of her inchoate suffering roused the old sharp flame in him, a mordant pity, a passion almost of cruelty. "You are awake now," he said to her. "What time is it?" came her muted voice. She seemed to flow back, almost like liquid, from his approach, to sink helplessly away from him. Her inchoate look of a violated slave, whose fulfillment lies in her further and further violation, made his nerves quiver with acutely desirable sensation. After all, his was the only will. She was the passive substance of his will. He tingled with the subtle, biting sensation. And then he knew he must go away from her. There must be pure separation between them. It was a quiet and ordinary breakfast, the four men all looking very clean and bathed. Gerald and the Russian were both correct and comme il faut in appearance and manner. Birkin was gaunt and sick, and looked a failure in his attempt to be a properly dressed man, like Gerald and Maxim. Halliday wore tweeds and a green flannel shirt and a rag of a tie, which was just right for him. The Hindu brought in a great deal of soft toast, and looked exactly the same as he had looked the night before, statically the same. At the end of the breakfast, the Pusam appeared, in a purple silk wrap with a shimmering sash. She had recovered herself somewhat, but was mute and lifeless still. It was a torment to her when anybody spoke to her. Her face was like a small, fine mask, sinister too, masked with unwilling suffering. It was almost midday. Gerald rose and went away to his business, glad to get out. But he had not finished. He was coming back again at evening. They were all dining together, and he had booked seats for the party, excepting Birkin, at a music hall. At night they came back to the flat very late again flushed with drink. Again the manservant, who invariably disappeared between the hours of 10 and 12 at night, came in silently and inscrutably with tea, bending in a slow, strange, leopard-like fashion to put the tray softly on the table. His face was immutable, aristocratic-looking, tinged slightly with gray under the skin. He was young and good-looking. But Birkin felt a slight sickness, looking at him, and feeling the slight grayness as an ash or a corruption, in the aristocratic inscrutability of expression and nauseating, bestial stupidity. Again they talked cordially and rousedly together. But already a certain friability was coming over the party. Birkin was mad with irritation. Halliday was turning in an insane hatred against Gerald. The Pusam was becoming hard and cold, like a flint knife, and Halliday was laying himself out to her. And her intention, ultimately, was to capture Halliday, to have complete power over him. In the morning they all stalked and lounged about again. But Gerald could feel a strange hostility to himself in the air. It roused his obstinacy, and he stood up against it. He hung on for 2 more days. The result was a nasty and insane scene with Halliday on the 4th evening. Halliday turned with absurd animosity upon Gerald. In the cafe, there was a row. Gerald was on the point of knocking in Halliday's face when he was filled with sudden disgust and indifference, and he went away, leaving Halliday in a foolish state of gloating triumph, the Pusam hard and established, and Maxim standing clear. Birkin was absent. He had gone out of town again. Gerald was piqued because he had left without giving the Pusam money. It was true. She did not care whether he gave her money or not, and he knew it. But she would have been glad of 10 pounds, and he would have been very glad to give them to her. Now he felt in a false position. He went away, chewing his lips to get at the ends of his short, clipped mustache. He knew the Pusam was merely glad to be rid of him. She had got her Halliday, whom she wanted. She wanted him completely in her power. Then she would marry him. She wanted to marry him. She had set her will on marrying Halliday. She never wanted to hear of Gerald again, unless, perhaps, she were in difficulty, because after all, Gerald was what she called a man, and these others, Halliday, Lebednikov, Birkin, the whole bohemian set, they were only half men. But it was half men she could deal with. She felt sure of herself with them. The real men, like Gerald, put her in her place too much. Still, she respected Gerald. She really respected him. She had managed to get his address so that she could appeal to him in time of distress. She knew he wanted to give her money. She would perhaps write to him on that inevitable rainy day.
8. Bruttleby.
Bruttleby was a Georgian house with Corinthian pillars, standing among the softer, greener hills of Derbyshire, not far from Cromford. In front, it looked over a lawn, over a few trees, down to a string of fish ponds in the hollow of the silent park. At the back were trees, among which were to be found the stables and the big kitchen garden, behind which was a wood. It was a very quiet place, some miles from the high road back from the Derwent Valley, outside the show scenery. Silent and forsaken. The golden stucco showed between the trees. The house front looked down the park, unchanged and unchanging. Of late, however, Hermione had lived a good deal at the house. She had turned away from London, away from Oxford, towards the silence of the country. Her father was mostly absent, abroad. She was either alone in the house, with her visitors, of whom there were always several, or she had with her brother, a bachelor and a Liberal member of Parliament. He always came down when the house was not sitting, seemed always to be present in Bruttleby, although he was most conscientious in his attendance to duty. The summer was just coming in when Ursula and Gudrun went to stay the second time with Hermione. Coming along in the car, after they had entered the park, they looked across the dip, where the fish ponds lay in silence, at the pillared front of the house, sunny and small like an English drawing of the old school, on the brow of the green hill, against the trees. There were small figures on the green lawn, women in lavender and yellow moving to the shade of the enormous, beautifully balanced cedar tree. "Isn't it complete?" said Gudrun. "It is as final as an old Aquitaine." She spoke with some resentment in her voice, as if she were captivated unwillingly, as if she must admire against her will. "Do you love it?" asked Ursula. "I don't love it, but in its way, I think it is quite complete." The motor car ran down the hill and up again in one breath, and they were curving to the side door. A parlor maid appeared, and then Hermione, coming forward with her pale face lifted and her hands outstretched, advancing straight to the newcomers, her voice singing. "Here you are, I'm so glad to see you." She kissed Gudrun, "So glad to see you." She kissed Ursula and remained with her arm round her. "Are you very tired?" "Not at all tired," said Ursula. "Are you tired, Gudrun?" "Not at all." "Thanks," said Gudrun.
No, droble Hermione.
And she stood and looked at them. The two girls were embarrassed because she would not move into the house, but must have her little scene of welcome there on the path. The servants waited. "Come in," said Hermione at last, having fully taken in the pair of them. Gudrun was the more beautiful and attractive. She had decided again. Ursula was more physical, more womanly. She admired Gudrun's dress more. It was of green poplin, with a loose coat above it, of broad, dark green and dark brown stripes. The hat was of a pale, greenish straw, the color of new hay, and it had a plaited ribbon of black and orange. The stockings were dark green, the shoes black. It was a good get-up, at once fashionable and individual. Ursula, in dark blue, was more ordinary, though she also looked well. Hermione herself wore a dress of prune-colored silk, with coral beads and coral-colored stockings. But her dress was both shabby and soiled, even rather dirty. "You would like to see your rooms now, wouldn't you?"
Yes.
"We will go up now, shall we?" Ursula was glad when she could be left alone in her room. Hermione lingered so long, made such a stress on one. She stood so near to one, pressing herself near upon one, in a way that was most embarrassing and oppressive. She seemed to hinder one's workings. Lunch was served on the lawn, under the great tree, whose thick, blackish boughs came down close to the grass. There were present a young Italian woman, slight and fashionable, a young, athletic-looking Miss Bradley, a learned, dry baronet of 50, who was always making witticisms and laughing at them heartily in a harsh, hoarse laugh. There was Rupert Birkin, and then a woman's secretary, a Fräulein Mars, young and slim and pretty. The food was very good, that was one thing. Gudrun, critical of everything, gave it her full approval. Ursula loved the situation, the white table by the cedar tree, the scent of new sunshine, the little vision of the leafy park, with far-off deer feeding peacefully. There seemed a magic circle drawn about the place, shutting out the present, enclosing the delightful, precious past, trees and deer and silence. like a dream. But in spirit, she was unhappy. The talk went on like a rattle of small artillery, always slightly sententious, with a sententiousness that was only emphasized by the continual crackling of a witticism, the continual spatter of verbal jest, designed to give a tone of flippancy to a stream of conversation that was all critical and general, a canal of conversation rather than a stream. The attitude was mental and very wearying. Only the elderly sociologist, whose mental fiber was so tough as to be insentient, seemed to be thoroughly happy. Birkin was down in the mouth. Hermione appeared, with amazing persistence, to wish to ridicule him and make him look ignominious in the eyes of everybody. And it was surprising how she seemed to succeed, how helpless he seemed against her. He looked completely insignificant. Ursula and Gudrun, both very amused, were mostly silent, listening to the slow, rhapsodic sing-song of Hermione, or the verbal sallies of Sir Joshua, or the prattle of Fräulein, or the responses of the other two women. Luncheon was over, coffee was brought out on the grass, the party left the table and sat about in lounge chairs, in the shade or in the sunshine as they wished. Fräulein departed into the house. Hermione took up her embroidery. The little Contessa took a book. Miss Bradley was weaving a basket out of fine grass, and there they all were on the lawn in the early summer afternoon, working leisurely and spattering with half-intellectual, deliberate talk. Suddenly, there was the sound of the brakes and the shutting off of a motor car. "There's Solsey," sang Hermione, in her slow, amusing sing-song. And laying down her work, she rose slowly and slowly passed over the lawn, round the bushes, out of sight. "Who is it?" asked Gudrun. "Mr. Rodice, Miss Roddice's brother. At least, I suppose it's he," said Sir Joshua. "Solsey, yes, it is her brother," said the little Contessa, lifting her head for a moment from her book and speaking as if to give information, in her slightly deepened, guttural English. They all waited, and then round the bushes came the tall form of Alexander Rodice, striding romantically like a Meredith hero who remembers Disraeli. He was cordial with everybody. He was at once a host, with an easy, offhand hospitality that he had learned for Hermione's friends. He had just come down from London from the House. At once the atmosphere of the House of Commons made itself felt over the lawn. The Home Secretary had said such and such a thing, and he, Rodice, on the other hand, thought such and such a thing, and had said so and so to the PM. Now Hermione came round the bushes with Gerald Critch. He had come along with Alexander. Gerald was presented to everybody, was kept by Hermione for a few moments in full view, then he was led away, still by Hermione. He was evidently her guest of the moment. There had been a split in the cabinet. The Minister for Education had resigned owing to adverse criticism. This started a conversation on education. "Of course," said Hermione, lifting her face like a rhapsodist, "there can be no reason, no excuse for education, except the joy and beauty of knowledge in itself." She seemed to rumble and ruminate with subterranean thoughts for a minute. Then she proceeded. "Vocational education isn't education. It is the close of education." Gerald, on the brink of discussion, sniffed the air with delight and prepared for action. "Not necessarily," he said. "But isn't education really like gymnastics? Isn't the end of education the production of a well-trained, vigorous, energetic mind? Just as athletics produce a healthy body, ready for anything," cried Miss Bradley, in hearty accord. Gudrun looked at her in silent loathing. "Well," rumbled Hermione, "I don't know. To me, the pleasure of knowing is so great, so wonderful. Nothing has meant so much to me in all life as certain knowledge. No, I am sure, nothing." "What knowledge, for example, Hermione?" asked Alexander. Hermione lifted her face and rumbled. I don't know. But one thing was the stars, when I really understood something about the stars. One feels so uplifted, so unbounded." Birkin looked at her in a white fury. "What do you want to feel unbounded for?" he said sarcastically. "You don't want to be unbounded." Hermione recoiled in offense. "Yes, but one does have that limitless feeling," said Gerald. "It's like getting on top of the mountain and seeing the Pacific." "Silent upon a peak in Darien," murmured the Italian, lifting her face for a moment from her book. "Not necessarily in Darien," said Gerald, while Ursula began to laugh. Hermione waited for the dust to settle, and then she said, untouched, "Yes, it is the greatest thing in life. To know. It is really to be happy, to be free." "Knowledge is, of course, liberty," said Matheson. "In compressed tabloids," said Birkin, looking at the dry, stiff little body of the baronet. Immediately Gudrun saw the famous sociologist as a flat bottle containing tabloids of compressed liberty. That pleased her. Sir Joshua was labeled and placed forever in her mind. "What does that mean, Rupert?" sang Hermione, in a calm snub. "You can only have knowledge, strictly," he replied, "of things concluded in the past. It's like bottling the liberty of last summer in the bottled gooseberries." "Can one have knowledge only of the past?" asked the baronet, pointedly. "Could we call our knowledge of the laws of gravitation, for instance, knowledge of the past?" "Yes," said Birkin. "There is a most beautiful thing in my book," suddenly piped the little Italian woman. "It says the man came to the door and threw his eyes down the street. There was a general laugh in the company. Miss Bradley went and looked over the shoulder of the Contessa. 'See,' said the Contessa. 'Bazarov came to the door and threw his eyes hurriedly down the street,' she read. Again there was a loud laugh, the most startling of which was the baronet's, which rattled out like a clatter of falling stones. 'What is the book?' asked Alexander promptly. 'Fathers and Sons' by Turgenev,' said the little foreigner, pronouncing every syllable distinctly. She looked at the cover to verify herself. 'An old American edition,' said Birkin. 'Ha, of course, translated from the French,' said Alexander, with a fine declamatory voice.
Bazarov ouvra la porte et jeta les yeux dans la rue.
He looked brightly round the company. 'I wonder what the hurriedly was,' said Ursula. They all began to guess. And then, to the amazement of everybody, the maid came hurrying with a large tea tray. The afternoon had passed so swiftly. After tea, they were all gathered for a walk. 'Would you like to come for a walk?' said Hermione to each of them, one by one. And they all said yes, feeling somehow like prisoners marshaled for exercise. Birkin only refused. 'Will you come for a walk, Rupert?' 'No, Hermione.' 'But are you sure?' 'Quite sure.' There was a second's hesitation. 'And why not?' sang Hermione's question. It made her blood run sharp, to be thwarted in even so trifling a matter. She intended them all to walk with her in the park. 'Because I don't like trooping off in a gang,' he said. Her voice rumbled in her throat for a moment. Then she said, with a curious stray calm, 'Then we'll leave a little boy behind, if he's sulky.' And she looked really gay, while she insulted him. But it merely made him stiff. She trailed off to the rest of the company, only turning to wave her handkerchief to him and to chuckle with laughter, singing out, 'Goodbye, goodbye, little boy.' 'Goodbye, impudent hag,' he said to himself. They all went through the park. Hermione wanted to show them the wild daffodils on a little slope. 'This way,' sang her leisurely voice at intervals. And they had all to come this way. The daffodils were pretty, but who could see them? Ursula was stiff all over with resentment by this time, resentment of the whole atmosphere. Gudrun, mocking and objective, watched and registered everything. They looked at the shy deer, and Hermione talked to the stag, as if he too were a boy she wanted to wheedle and fondle. He was male, so she must exert some kind of power over him. They trailed home by the fish ponds, and Hermione told them about the quarrel of two male swans who had striven for the love of the one lady. She chuckled and laughed as she told how the ousted lover had sat with his head buried under his wing on the gravel. When they arrived back at the house, Hermione stood on the lawn and sang out, in a strange, small, high voice that carried very far. 'Rupert, Rupert.' The first syllable was high and slow. The second dropped down. 'Ruopert.' But there was no answer. A maid appeared. 'Where is Mr. Birkin, Alice?' asked the mild, straying voice of Hermione. But under the straying voice, what a persistent, almost insane will. 'I think he's in his room, madam.' 'Is he?' Hermione went slowly up the stairs, along the corridor, singing out in her high, small call, 'Ruopert.' Rupert. She came to his door and tapped, still crying. Rupert. Yes, sounded his voice at last. What are you doing? The question was mild and curious. There was no answer. Then he opened the door. We've come back, said Hermione. The daffodils are so beautiful. Yes, he said. I've seen them. She looked at him with her long, slow, impassive look along her cheeks. Have you? She echoed. And she remained looking at him. She was stimulated above all things by this conflict with him, when he was like a sulky boy, helpless, and she had him safe at Brettleby. But underneath she knew the split was coming, and her hatred of him was subconscious and intense. What were you doing? She reiterated in her mild, indifferent tone. He did not answer, and she made her way, almost unconsciously, into his room. He had taken a Chinese drawing of geese from the boudoir and was copying it with much skill and vividness. You are copying the drawing, she said, standing near the table and looking down at his work. Yes. How beautifully you do it. You like it very much, don't you? It's a marvelous drawing, he said. Is it? I'm so glad you like it, because I've always been fond of it. The Chinese ambassador gave it me. I know, he said. But why do you copy it? She asked, casual and sing-song. Why not do something original? I want to know it, he replied. One gets more of China copying this picture than reading all the books. And what do you get? She was at once roused. She laid, as it were, violent hands on him to extract his secrets from him. She must know. It was a dreadful tyranny, an obsession in her, to know all he knew. For some time he was silent, hating to answer her. Then, compelled, he began. I know what centers they live from, what they perceive and feel, the hot, stinging centrality of a goose in the flux of cold water and mud, the curious bitter stinging heat of a goose's blood, entering their own blood like an inoculation of corruptive fire, fire of the cold burning mud, the lotus mystery. Hermione looked at him along her narrow, pallid cheeks. Her eyes were strange and drugged, heavy under their heavy, drooping lids. Her thin bosom shrugged convulsively. He stared back at her, devilish and unchanging. With another strange, sick convulsion, she turned away as if she were sick, could feel dissolution setting in her body. For with her mind, she was unable to attend to his words. He caught her, as it were, beneath all her defenses, and destroyed her with some insidious, occult potency. Yes, she said, as if she did not know what she were saying. Yes, and she swallowed, and tried to regain her mind. But she could not. She was witless, decentralized. Use all her will as she might, she could not recover. She suffered the ghastliness of dissolution, broken and gone in a horrible corruption. And he stood and looked at her unmoved. She strayed out, pallid and preyed upon like a ghost, like one attacked by the tomb influences which dog us. And she was gone like a corpse that has no presence, no connection. He remained hard and vindictive. Hermione came down to dinner strange and sepulchral, her eyes heavy and full of sepulchral darkness, strength. She had put on a dress of stiff old greenish brocade that fitted tight and made her look tall and rather terrible, ghastly. In the gay light of the drawing room, she was uncanny and oppressive. But seated in the half-light of the dining room, sitting stiffly before the shaded candles on the table, she seemed a power, a presence. She listened and attended with a drugged attention. The party was gay and extravagant in appearance. Everybody had put on evening dress except Birkin and Joshua Matheson. The little Italian Contessa wore a dress of tissue, of orange and gold and black velvet in soft wide stripes. Gudrun was emerald green with strange network. Ursula was in yellow with dull silver veiling. Miss Bradley was of gray, crimson and jet. Fräulein Mars wore pale blue. It gave Hermione a sudden convulsive sensation of pleasure to see these rich colors under the candlelight. She was aware of the talk going on, ceaselessly, Joshua's voice dominating, of the ceaseless pitter-patter of women's light laughter and responses, of the brilliant colors and the white table and the shadow above and below, and she seemed in a swoon of gratification, convulsed with pleasure and yet sick, like a revenant. She took very little part in the conversation, yet she heard it all. It was all hers. They all went together into the drawing room, as if they were one family, easily, without any attention to ceremony. Fräulein handed the coffee. Everybody smoked cigarettes, or else long warden pipes of white clay, of which a sheaf was provided. "Will you smoke? Cigarettes or pipe?" asked Fräulein prettily. There was a circle of people: Sir Joshua with his 18th century appearance, Gerald the amused, handsome young Englishman, Alexander tall and the handsome politician, democratic and lucid, Hermione strange like a long Cassandra, and the women lurid with color, all dutifully smoking their long white pipes and sitting in a half-moon in the comfortable, soft-lighted drawing room, round the logs that flickered on the marble hearth. The talk was very often political or sociological and interesting, curiously anarchistic. There was an accumulation of powerful force in the room, powerful and destructive. Everything seemed to be thrown into the melting pot, and it seemed to Ursula they were all witches, helping the pot to bubble. There was an elation and a satisfaction in it all, but it was cruelly exhausting for the newcomers, this ruthless mental pressure, this powerful, consuming, destructive mentality that emanated from Joshua and Hermione and Birkin and dominated the rest. But a sickness, a fearful nausea gathered possession of Hermione. There was a lull in the talk, as it was arrested by her unconscious but all-powerful will. "Salzy, won't you play something?" said Hermione, breaking off completely. "Won't somebody dance? Gudrun, you will dance, won't you? I wish you would."
Anche tu, palestra, ballerai? Sì, per piacere.
"You too, Ursula." Hermione rose and slowly pulled the gold-embroidered band that hung by the mantel, clinging to it for a moment, then releasing it suddenly. Like a priestess she looked, unconscious, sunk in a heavy half-trance. A servant came and soon reappeared with armfuls of silk robes and shawls and scarves, mostly oriental, things that Hermione, with her love for beautiful extravagant dress, had collected gradually. "The three women will dance together," she said. "What shall it be?" asked Alexander, rising briskly. "Virginie del Rachet," said the Contessa at once. "They are so languid," said Ursula. "The three witches from Macbeth," suggested Fräulein usefully. It was finally decided to do Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. Ursula was Naomi, Gudrun was Ruth, the Contessa was Orpah. The idea was to make a little ballet in the style of the Russian ballet of Pavlova and Nijinsky. The Contessa was ready first. Alexander went to the piano. A space was cleared. Orpah, in beautiful oriental clothes, began slowly to dance the death of her husband. Then Ruth came, and they wept together and lamented. Then Naomi came to comfort them. It was all done in dumb show. The women danced their emotion in gesture and motion. The little drama went on for a quarter of an hour. Ursula was beautiful as Naomi. All her men were dead. It remained to her only to stand alone in indomitable assertion, demanding nothing. Ruth, woman-loving, loved her. Orpah, a vivid, sensational, subtle widow, would go back to the former life, a repetition. The interplay between the women was real and rather frightening. It was strange to see how Gudrun clung with heavy, desperate passion to Ursula, yet smiled with subtle malevolence against her, how Ursula accepted silently, unable to provide any more either for herself or for the other, but dangerous and indomitable, refuting her grief. Hermione loved to watch. She could see the Contessa's rapid, stoat-like sensationalism, Gudrun's ultimate but treacherous cleaving to the woman in her sister, Ursula's dangerous helplessness, as if she were helplessly weighted and unreleased. That was very beautiful. Everybody cried with one accord. But Hermione writhed in her soul, knowing what she could not know. She cried out for more dancing, and it was her will that set the Contessa and Birkin moving mockingly in Malbrook. Gerald was excited by the desperate cleaving of Gudrun to Naomi. The essence of that female, subterranean recklessness and mockery penetrated his blood. He could not forget Gudrun's lifted, offered, cleaving, reckless, yet withal mocking weight. And Birkin, watching like a hermit crab from its hole, had seen the brilliant frustration and helplessness of Ursula. She was rich, full of dangerous power. She was like a strange, unconscious bud of powerful womanhood. He was unconsciously drawn to her. She was his future. Alexander played some Hungarian music, and they all danced, seized by the spirit. Gerald was marvelously exhilarated at finding himself in motion, moving towards Gudrun, dancing with feet that could not yet escape from the waltz and the two-step, but feeling his force stir along his limbs and his body, out of captivity. He did not know yet how to dance their convulsive, ragtime sort of dancing, but he knew how to begin. Birkin, when he could get free from the weight of the people present, whom he disliked, danced rapidly and with a real gaiety. And how Hermione hated him for this irresponsible gaiety. "Now I see," cried the Contessa excitedly, watching his purely gay motion, which he had all to himself. "Mr. Birkin, he is a changer." Hermione looked at her slowly and shuddered, knowing that only a foreigner could have seen and have said this. "Cosa vuol dire palestra?" she asked sing-song. "Look," said the Contessa in Italian. "He is not a man, he is a chameleon, a creature of change." "He is not a man, he is treacherous, not one of us," said itself over in Hermione's consciousness. And her soul writhed in the black subjugation to him because of his power to escape, to exist other than she did, because he was not consistent, not a man, less than a man. She hated him in a despair that shattered her and broke her down, so that she suffered sheer dissolution like a corpse and was unconscious of everything save the horrible sickness of dissolution that was taking place within her, body and soul. The house being full, Gerald was given the smaller room, really the dressing room, communicating with Birkin's bedroom. When they all took their candles and mounted the stairs, where the lamps were burning subduedly, Hermione captured Ursula and brought her into her own bedroom to talk to her. A sort of constraint came over Ursula in the big, strange bedroom. Hermione seemed to be bearing down on her, awful and inchoate, making some appeal. They were looking at some Indian silk shirts, gorgeous and sensual in themselves, their shape, their almost corrupt gorgeousness. And Hermione came near, and her bosom writhed, and Ursula was for a moment blank with panic. And for a moment Hermione's haggard eyes saw the fear on the face of the other. There was again a sort of crash, a crashing down. And Ursula picked up a shirt of rich red and blue silk, made for a young princess of 14, and was crying mechanically. "Isn't it wonderful? Who would dare to put those two strong colors together?" Then Hermione's maid entered silently, and Ursula, overcome with dread, escaped, carried away by powerful impulse. Birkin went straight to bed. He was feeling happy and sleepy.
Since he had danced, he was happy.
But Gerald would talk to him. Gerald, in evening dress, sat on Birkin's bed when the other lay down and must talk. "Who are those two Brangwens?" Gerald asked. "They live in Beldover." "In Beldover?
Who are they then?"
"Teachers in the grammar school." There was a pause. "They are," exclaimed Gerald at length. "I thought I had seen them before." "It disappoints you?" said Birkin. "Disappoints me? No. But how is it Hermione has them here?" She knew Gudrun in London. "That's the younger one, the one with the darker hair. She's an artist, does sculpture and modeling." "She's not a teacher in the grammar school, then. Only the other?" "Both. Gudrun art mistress, Ursula a class mistress." "And what's the father?" "Handicraft instructor in the schools." "Really?" Class barriers are breaking down. Gerald was always uneasy under the slightly jeering tone of the other. That their father is handicraft instructor in a school. What does it matter to me? Birkin laughed. Gerald looked at his face, as it lay there laughing and bitter and indifferent on the pillow, and he could not go away. "I don't suppose you will see very much more of Gudrun, at least. She is a restless bird. She'll be gone in a week or two," said Birkin. "Where will she go?" "London, Paris, Rome. Heaven knows. I always expect her to sheer off to Damascus or San Francisco. She's a bird of paradise. God knows what she's got to do with Beldover. It goes by contraries, like dreams." Gerald pondered for a few moments. "How do you know her so well?" he asked. "I knew her in London," he replied, "in the Algernon Strange set." She'll know. And she makes money, apart from her teaching? Asked Gerald. Some, irregularly. She can sell her models. She has a certain réclame. How much for? A guinea, 10 guineas. And are they good? What are they? I think sometimes they are marvelously good. That is hers. Those two wagtails in Hermione's boudoir. You've seen them. They are carved in wood and painted. I thought it was savage carving again. No, hers. That's what they are, animals and birds, sometimes odd small people in everyday dress. Really rather wonderful when they come off. They have a sort of funniness that is quite unconscious and subtle. She might be a well-known artist one day, mused Gerald. She might, but I think she won't. She drops her art if anything else catches her. Her contrariness prevents her taking it seriously. She must never be too serious. She feels she might give herself away. And she won't give herself away. She's always on the defensive. That's what I can't stand about her type. By the way, how did things go off with Pusum after I left you? I haven't heard anything. Oh, rather disgusting. Halliday turned objectionable, and I only just saved myself from jumping in his stomach, in a real old-fashioned row. Birkin was silent. Of course, he said, Julius is somewhat insane. On the one hand, he's had religious mania, and on the other, he is fascinated by obscenity. Either he is a pure servant, washing the feet of Christ, or else he is making obscene drawings of Jesus, action and reaction. And between the two, nothing. He is really insane. He wants a pure lily, another girl, with a baby face on the one hand, and on the other, he must have the Pusum, just to defile himself with her. That's what I can't make out, said Gerald. Does he love her, the Pusum, or doesn't he? He neither does nor doesn't. She is the harlot, the actual harlot of adultery to him. And he's got a craving to throw himself into the filth of her. Then he gets up and calls on the name of the lily of purity, the baby-faced girl, and so enjoys himself all round. It's the old story, action and reaction and nothing between. I don't know, said Gerald after a pause, that he does insult the Pusum so very much. She strikes me as being rather foul. But I thought you liked her, exclaimed Birkin. I always felt fond of her. I never had anything to do with her, personally. That's true. I liked her all right for a couple of days, said Gerald. But a week of her would have turned me over. There's a certain smell about the skin of those women that in the end is sickening beyond words, even if you like it at first. I know, said Birkin. Then he added, rather fretfully, but go to bed, Gerald. God knows what time it is. Gerald looked at his watch, and at length rose off the bed, and went to his room. But he returned in a few minutes, in his shirt. One thing, he said, seating himself on the bed again. We finished up rather stormily, and I never had time to give her anything. Money, said Birkin. She'll get what she wants from Halliday or from one of her acquaintances. But then, said Gerald, I'd rather give her her dues and settle the account. She doesn't care. No, perhaps not. But one feels the account is left open, and one would rather it were closed. Would you? Said Birkin. He was looking at the white legs of Gerald, as the latter sat on the side of the bed in his shirt. They were white-skinned, full, muscular legs, handsome and decided. Yet they moved Birkin with a sort of pathos, tenderness, as if they were childish. I think I'd rather close the account, said Gerald, repeating himself vaguely. It doesn't matter one way or another, said Birkin. You always say it doesn't matter, said Gerald, a little puzzled, looking down at the face of the other man affectionately. Neither does it, said Birkin. But she was a decent sort, really. Render unto Caesarina the things that are Caesarina's, said Birkin, turning aside. It seemed to him Gerald was talking for the sake of talking. Go away, it wearies me. It's too late at night, he said. I wish you'd tell me something that didn't matter, said Gerald, looking down all the time at the face of the other man, waiting for something. But Birkin turned his face aside. All right then. Go to sleep, said Gerald, and he laid his hand affectionately on the other man's shoulder and went away. In the morning when Gerald awoke and heard Birkin move, he called out, I still think I ought to give the Pusum £10. Oh God, said Birkin. Don't be so matter-of-fact. Close the account in your own soul if you like. It is there you can't close it. How do you know I can't? Knowing you. Gerald meditated for some moments. It seems to me the right thing to do, with the Pusums is to pay them. And the right thing for mistresses. Keep them. And the right thing for wives. Live under the same roof with them. Integer vitae celeris perus, said Birkin. There's no need to be nasty about it, said Gerald. It bores me. I'm not interested in your peccadillos. And I don't care whether you are or not. I am. The morning was again sunny. The maid had been in and brought the water, and had drawn the curtains. Birkin, sitting up in bed, looked lazily and pleasantly out on the park that was so green and deserted, romantic, belonging to the past. He was thinking how lovely, how sure, how formed, how final all the things of the past were. The lovely accomplished past, this house, so still and golden, the park slumbering its centuries of peace. And then, what a snare and a delusion, this beauty of static things, what a horrible, dead prison brought by really was, what an intolerable confinement, the peace. Yet it was better than the sordid scrambling conflict of the present. If only one might create the future after one's own heart, for a little pure truth, a little unflinching application of simple truth to life, the heart cried out ceaselessly. I can't see what you will leave me at all to be interested in, came Gerald's voice from the lower room. Neither the Pusums, nor the mines, nor anything else. You be interested in what you can, Gerald. Only I'm not interested myself, said Birkin. What am I to do at all, then, came Gerald's voice. What you like. What am I to do myself? In the silence, Birkin could feel Gerald musing this fact. I'm blessed if I know, came the good-humored answer. You see, said Birkin, part of you wants the Pusum and nothing but the Pusum. Part of you wants the mines, the business, and nothing but the business. And there you are, all in bits. And part of me wants something else, said Gerald, in a queer, quiet, real voice. What? Said Birkin, rather surprised. That's what I hoped you could tell me, said Gerald. There was a silence for some time. I can't tell you. I can't find my own way, let alone yours. You might marry, Birkin replied. Who, the Pusum? Asked Gerald. Perhaps, said Birkin. And he rose and went to the window. That is your panacea, said Gerald. But you haven't even tried it on yourself yet, and you are sick enough. I am, said Birkin. Still, I shall come right. Through marriage. Yes, Birkin answered obstinately. And no, added Gerald. No, my boy. There was a silence between them and a strange tension of hostility. They always kept a gap, a distance between them. They wanted always to be free each of the other. Yet there was a curious heart straining towards each other. Solvitur femininus, said Gerald satirically. Why not? Said Birkin. No reason at all, said Gerald. If it really works. But whom will you marry? A woman, said Birkin. Good, said Gerald. Birkin and Gerald were the last to come down to breakfast. Hermione liked everybody to be early. She suffered when she felt her day was diminished. She felt she had missed her life. She seemed to grip the hours by the throat, to force her life from them. She was rather pale and ghastly, as if left behind in the morning. Yet she had her power. Her will was strangely pervasive. With the entrance of the two young men, a sudden tension was felt. She lifted her face and said, in her amused sing-song, Good morning. Did you sleep well? I'm so glad. And she turned away, ignoring them. Birkin, who knew her well, saw that she intended to discount his existence. Will you take what you want from the sideboard? Said Alexander, in a voice slightly suggesting disapprobation. I hope the things aren't cold. Oh no. Do you mind putting out the flame under the chafing dish, Rupert? Thank you. Even Alexander was rather authoritative where Hermione was cool. He took his tone from her inevitably. Birkin sat down and looked at the table. He was so used to this house, to this room, to this atmosphere, through years of intimacy, and now he felt in complete opposition to it all. It had nothing to do with him. How well he knew Hermione, as she sat there, erect and silent and somewhat bemused, and yet so potent, so powerful. He knew her statically so finally that it was almost like a madness. It was difficult to believe one was not mad, that one was not a figure in the Hall of Kings in some Egyptian tomb, where the dead all sat immemorial and tremendous. How utterly he knew Joshua Matheson, who was talking in his harsh, yet rather mincing voice, endlessly, always with a strong mentality working, always interesting, and yet always known, everything he said known beforehand, however novel it was and clever. Alexander, the up-to-date host, so bloodlessly free and easy, Fräulein so prettily chiming in just as she should, the little Italian countess taking notice of everybody, only playing her little game, objective and cold, like a weasel watching everything and extracting her own amusement, never giving herself in the slightest. Then Miss Bradley, heavy and rather subservient, treated with cool, almost amused contempt by Hermione, and therefore slighted by everybody. How known it all was, like a game with the figures set out, the same figures, the queen of chess, the knights, the pawns, the same now as they were hundreds of years ago, the same figures moving round in one of the innumerable permutations that make up the game. But the game is known, its going on is like a madness. It is so exhausted. There was Gerald, an amused look on his face. The game pleased him. There was Gudrun, watching with steady, large, hostile eyes. The game fascinated her, and she loathed it. There was Ursula, with a slightly startled look on her face, as if she were hurt, and the pain were just outside her consciousness. Suddenly Birkin got up and went out. "That's enough," he said to himself involuntarily. Hermione knew his motion, though not in her consciousness. She lifted her heavy eyes and saw him lapse suddenly away on a sudden, unknown tide, and the waves broke over her. Only her indomitable will remained static and mechanical. She sat at the table making her musing, stray remarks. But the darkness had covered her. She was like a ship that has gone down. It was finished for her too. She was wrecked in the darkness. Yet the unfailing mechanism of her will worked on. She had that activity. "Shall we bathe this morning?" she said, suddenly looking at them all. "Splendid," said Joshua. "It is a perfect morning." "Oh, it is beautiful," said Fräulein. "Yes, let us bathe," said the Italian woman. "We have no bathing suits," said Gerald. "Have mine," said Alexander. "I must go to church and read the lessons. They expect me." "Are you a Christian?" asked the Italian countess, with sudden interest. "No," said Alexander. "I'm not, but I believe in keeping up the old institutions." "They are so beautiful," said Fräulein daintily. "Oh, they are," cried Miss Bradley. They all trailed out onto the lawn. It was a sunny, soft morning in early summer, when life ran in the world subtly, like a reminiscence. The church bells were ringing a little way off. Not a cloud was in the sky. The swans were like lilies on the water below. The peacocks walked with long, prancing steps across the shadow and into the sunshine of the grass. One wanted to swoon into the bygone perfection of it all. "Goodbye," called Alexander, waving his gloves cheerily, and he disappeared behind the bushes on his way to church. "Now," said Hermione, "shall we all bathe?" "I won't," said Ursula. "You don't want to?" said Hermione, looking at her slowly.
No.
"I don't want to," said Ursula. "Nor I," said Gudrun. "What about my suit?" asked Gerald. "I don't know," laughed Hermione, with an odd, amused intonation. "Will a handkerchief do? A large handkerchief." "That will do," said Gerald. "Come along then," sang Hermione. The first to run across the lawn was the little Italian, small and like a cat, her white legs twinkling as she went, ducking slightly her head, that was tied in a gold silk kerchief. She tripped through the gate and down the grass, and stood, like a tiny figure of ivory and bronze, at the water's edge, having dropped off her toweling, watching the swans, which came up in surprise. Then out ran Miss Bradley, like a large, soft plum in her dark blue suit. Then Gerald came, a scarlet silk kerchief round his loins, his towels over his arms. He seemed to flaunt himself a little in the sun, lingering and laughing, strolling easily, looking white but natural in his nakedness. Then came Sir Joshua, in an overcoat, and lastly Hermione, striding with stiff grace from out of a great mantle of purple silk, her head tied up in purple and gold. Handsome was her stiff, long body, her straight-stepping white legs. There was a static magnificence about her as she let the cloak float loosely away from her striding. She crossed the lawn like some strange memory and passed slowly and statelily towards the water. There were 3 ponds, in terraces descending the valley, large and smooth and beautiful, lying in the sun. The water ran over a little stone wall, over small rocks, splashing down from one pond to the level below. The swans had gone out onto the opposite bank. The reeds smelled sweet. A faint breeze touched the skin. Gerald had dived in, after Sir Joshua, and had swum to the end of the pond. There he climbed out and sat on the wall. There was a dive, and the little countess was swimming like a rat to join him. They both sat in the sun, laughing and crossing their arms on their breasts. Sir Joshua swam up to them and stood near them, up to his armpits in the water. Then Hermione and Miss Bradley swam over, and they sat in a row on the embankment. "Aren't they terrifying? Aren't they really terrifying?" said Gudrun. "Don't they look saurian? They are just like great lizards. Did you ever see anything like Sir Joshua? But really, Ursula, he belongs to the primeval world, when great lizards crawled about." Gudrun looked in dismay on Sir Joshua, who stood up to the breast in the water, his long, grayish hair washed down into his eyes, his neck set into thick, crude shoulders. He was talking to Miss Bradley, who, seated on the bank above, plump and big and wet, looked as if she might roll and slither in the water almost like one of the slithering Celians in the zoo. Ursula watched in silence. Gerald was laughing happily between Hermione and the Italian. He reminded her of Dionysus because his hair was really yellow, his figure so full and laughing. Hermione, in her large, stiff, sinister grace, leaned near him, frightening, as if she were not responsible for what she might do. He knew a certain danger in her, a convulsive madness. But he only laughed the more, turning often to the little countess, who was flashing up her face at him. They all dropped into the water and were swimming together like a shoal of seals. Hermione was powerful and unconscious in the water, large and slow and powerful. Palestra was quick and silent as a water rat. Gerald wavered and flickered, a white natural shadow. Then, one after the other, they waded out and went up to the house. But Gerald lingered a moment to speak to Gudrun. "You don't like the water?" he said. She looked at him with a long, slow, inscrutable look as he stood before her negligently, the water standing in beads all over his skin. "I like it very much," she replied. He paused, expecting some sort of explanation. "And you swim?" "Yes, I swim." Still, he would not ask her why she would not go in then. He could feel something ironic in her. He walked away, piqued for the first time. "Why wouldn't you bathe?" he asked her again later, when he was once more the properly dressed young Englishman. She hesitated a moment before answering, opposing his persistence. "Because I didn't like the crowd," she replied. He laughed. Her phrase seemed to re-echo in his consciousness. The flavor of her slang was piquant to him, whether he would or not. She signified the real world to him. He wanted to come up to her standards, fulfill her expectations. He knew that her criterion was the only one that mattered. The others were all outsiders, instinctively, whatever they might be socially. And Gerald could not help it. He was bound to strive to come up to her criterion, fulfill her idea of a man and a human being. After lunch, when all the others had withdrawn, Hermione and Gerald and Birkin lingered, finishing their talk. There had been some discussion, on the whole quite intellectual and artificial, about a new state, a new world of man. Supposing this old social state were broken and destroyed, then, out of the chaos, what then? "The great social idea," said Sir Joshua, "was the social equality of man." "No," said Gerald, "the idea was that every man was fit for his own little bit of a task. Let him do that and then please himself. The unifying principle was the work in hand. Only work, the business of production, held men together. It was mechanical, but then society was a mechanism. Apart from work, they were isolated, free to do as they liked. "Oh," cried Gudrun, "then we shan't have names anymore. We shall be like the Germans, nothing but Herr Obermeister and Herr Untermeister." I can imagine it. "I am Mrs. Colliery Manager Critch. I am Mrs. Member of Parliament Rawdice. I am Miss Art Teacher Brangwen." Very pretty, that. "Things would work very much better, Miss Art Teacher Brangwen," said Gerald. "What things, Mr. Colliery Manager Critch? The relation between you and me, par exemple?" "Yes, for example," cried the Italian, "that which is between men and women." "That is non-social," said Birkin, sarcastically. "Exactly," said Gerald. "Between me and a woman, the social question does not enter. It is my own affair." "A 10-pound note on it," said Birkin. "You don't admit that a woman is a social being?" asked Ursula of Gerald. "She is both," said Gerald. "She is a social being as far as society is concerned, but for her own private self, she is a free agent. It is her own affair, what she does." "But won't it be rather difficult to arrange the two halves?" asked Ursula. "Oh no," replied Gerald. "They arrange themselves naturally. We see it now, everywhere." "Don't you laugh so pleasantly till you're out of the wood," said Birkin. Gerald knitted his brows in momentary irritation. "Was I laughing?" he said. "If," said Hermione at last, "we could only realize that in the spirit we are all one, all equal in the spirit, all brothers there, the rest wouldn't matter. There would be no more of this carping and envy and this struggle for power, which destroys, only destroys." This speech was received in silence, and almost immediately the party rose from the table. But when the others had gone, Birkin turned round in bitter declamation, saying, "It is just the opposite, just the contrary, Hermione. We are all different and unequal in spirit. It is only the social differences that are based on accidental material conditions. We are all abstractly or mathematically equal, if you like. Every man has hunger and thirst, 2 eyes, 1 nose, and 2 legs. We're all the same in point of number. But spiritually, there is pure difference, and neither equality nor inequality counts. It is upon these 2 bits of knowledge that you must found a state. Your democracy is an absolute lie. Your brotherhood of man is a pure falsity if you apply it further than the mathematical abstraction. We all drank milk first. We all eat bread and meat. We all want to ride in motor cars. Therein lies the beginning and the end of the brotherhood of man. But no equality. But I, myself, who am myself? What have I to do with equality, with any other man or woman? In the spirit, I am as separate as one star is from another, as different in quality and quantity. Establish a state on that. One man isn't any better than another, not because they are equal, but because they are intrinsically other, that there is no term of comparison. The minute you begin to compare, one man is seen to be far better than another. All the inequality you can imagine is there by nature. I want every man to have his share in the world's goods, so that I am rid of his importunity, so that I can tell him, now you've got what you want. You've got your fair share of the world's gear. Now, you one-mouthed fool, mind yourself and don't obstruct me." Hermione was looking at him with leering eyes along her cheeks. He could feel violent waves of hatred and loathing of all he said coming out of her. It was dynamic hatred and loathing coming strong and black out of the unconsciousness. She heard his words in her unconscious self. Consciously, she was as if deafened. She paid no heed to them. "It sounds like megalomania, Rupert," said Gerald genially. Hermione gave a queer, grunting sound. Birkin stood back. "Yes, let it," he said suddenly, the whole tone gone out of his voice that had been so insistent, bearing everybody down. And he went away. But he felt, later, a little compunction. He had been violent, cruel with poor Hermione. He wanted to recompense her, to make it up. He had hurt her. He had been vindictive. He wanted to be on good terms with her again. He went into her boudoir, a remote and very cushiony place. She was sitting at her table writing letters. She lifted her face abstractedly when he entered, watched him go to the sofa, and sit down. Then she looked down at her paper again. He took up a large volume which he had been reading before and became minutely attentive to his author. His back was towards Hermione. She could not go on with her writing. Her whole mind was a chaos, darkness breaking in upon it, and herself struggling to gain control with her will, as a swimmer struggles with the swirling water. But in spite of her efforts, she was borne down. Darkness seemed to break over her. She felt as if her heart was bursting. The terrible tension grew stronger and stronger. It was most fearful agony, like being walled up. And then she realized that his presence was the wall. His presence was destroying her. Unless she could break out, she must die most fearfully, walled up in horror. And he was the wall. She must break down the wall. She must break him down before her, the awful obstruction of him who obstructed her life to the last. It must be done, or she must perish most horribly. Terrible shocks ran over her body, like shocks of electricity, as if many volts of electricity suddenly struck her down. She was aware of him sitting silently there, an unthinkable evil obstruction. Only this blotted out her mind, pressed out her very breathing, his silent, stooping back, the back of his head. A terrible voluptuous thrill ran down her arms. She was going to know her voluptuous consummation. Her arms quivered and were strong, immeasurably and irresistibly strong. What delight in strength, what delirium of pleasure. She was going to have her consummation of voluptuous ecstasy at last. It was coming. In utmost terror and agony, she knew it was upon her now, in extremity of bliss. Her hand closed on a blue, beautiful ball of lapis lazuli that stood on her desk for a paperweight. She rolled it round in her hand as she rose silently. Her heart was a pure flame in her breast. She was purely unconscious in ecstasy. She moved towards him and stood behind him for a moment in ecstasy. He, closed within the spell, remained motionless and unconscious. Then swiftly, in a flame that drenched down her body like fluid lightning and gave her a perfect, unutterable consummation, unutterable satisfaction, she brought down the ball of jewel stone with all her force, crash on his head. But her fingers were in the way and deadened the blow. Nevertheless, down went his head on the table on which his book lay. The stone slid aside and over his ear. It was one convulsion of pure bliss for her, lit up by the crushed pain of her fingers. But it was not somehow complete. She lifted her arm high to aim once more, straight down on the head that lay dazed on the table. She must smash it. It must be smashed before her ecstasy was consummated, fulfilled forever. 1,000 lives, 1,000 deaths mattered nothing now, only the fulfillment of this perfect ecstasy. She was not swift, she could only move slowly. A strong spirit in him woke him and made him lift his face and twist to look at her. Her arm was raised, the hand clasping the ball of lapis lazuli. It was her left hand. He realized again with horror that she was left-handed. Hurriedly, with a burrowing motion, he covered his head under the thick volume of Thucydides, and the blow came down, almost breaking his neck and shattering his heart. He was shattered, but he was not afraid. Twisting round to face her, he pushed the table over and got away from her. He was like a flask that is smashed to atoms. He seemed to himself that he was all fragments, smashed to bits. Yet his movements were perfectly coherent and clear. His soul was entire and unsurprised. "No, you don't, Hermione," he said in a low voice. "I don't let you." He saw her standing tall and livid and attentive, the stone clenched tense in her hand. "Stand away and let me go," he said, drawing near to her. As if pressed back by some hand, she stood away, watching him all the time without changing, like a neutralized angel confronting him. "It is not good," he said, when he had gone past her. "It isn't I who will die. You hear?" He kept his face to her as he went out, lest she should strike again. While he was on his guard, she dared not move. And he was on his guard, she was powerless. So he had gone, and left her standing. She remained perfectly rigid, standing as she was for a long time. Then she staggered to the couch and lay down, and went heavily to sleep. When she awoke, she remembered what she had done, but it seemed to her she had only hit him, as any woman might do, because he tortured her. She was perfectly right. She knew that spiritually she was right. In her own infallible purity, She had done what must be done. She was right, she was pure. A drugged, almost sinister religious expression became permanent on her face. Birkin, barely conscious and yet perfectly direct in his motion, went out of the house and straight across the park, to the open country, to the hills. The brilliant day had become overcast. Spots of rain were falling. He wandered on to a wild valley side, where were thickets of hazel, many flowers, tufts of heather, and little clumps of young fir trees, budding with soft paws. It was rather wet everywhere. There was a stream running down at the bottom of the valley, which was gloomy, or seemed gloomy. He was aware that he could not regain his consciousness, that he was moving in a sort of darkness. Yet he wanted something. He was happy in the wet hillside that was overgrown and obscure with bushes and flowers. He wanted to touch them all, to saturate himself with the touch of them all. He took off his clothes and sat down naked among the primroses, moving his feet softly among the primroses, his legs, his knees, his arms right up to the armpits, lying down and letting them touch his belly, his breasts. It was such a fine, cool, subtle touch all over him. He seemed to saturate himself with their contact. But they were too soft. He went through the long grass to a clump of young fir trees that were no higher than a man. The soft, sharp boughs beat upon him as he moved in keen pangs against them, threw little cold showers of drops on his belly, and beat his loins with their clusters of soft, sharp needles. There was a thistle which pricked him vividly, but not too much, because all his movements were too discriminate and soft. To lie down and roll in the sticky, cool young hyacinths, to lie on one's belly and cover one's back with handfuls of fine wet grass, soft as a breath, soft and more delicate and more beautiful than the touch of any woman, and then to sting one's thigh against the living dark bristles of the fir boughs, and then to feel the light whip of the hazel on one's shoulders, stinging, and then to clasp the silvery birch trunk against one's breast. Its smoothness, its hardness, its vital knots and ridges, this was good, this was all very good, very satisfying. Nothing else would do, nothing else would satisfy, except this coolness and subtlety of vegetation traveling into one's blood. How fortunate he was that there was this lovely, subtle, responsive vegetation waiting for him as he waited for it. How fulfilled he was, how happy. As he dried himself a little with his handkerchief, he thought about Hermione and the blow. He could feel a pain on the side of his head. But after all, what did it matter? What did Hermione matter? What did people matter altogether? There was this perfect, cool loneliness, so lovely and fresh and unexplored. Really, what a mistake he had made, thinking he wanted people, thinking he wanted a woman. He did not want a woman, not in the least. The leaves and the primroses and the trees, they were really lovely and cool and desirable. They really came into the blood and were added onto him. He was enriched now immeasurably, and so glad. It was quite right of Hermione to want to kill him. What had he to do with her? Why should he pretend to have anything to do with human beings at all? Here was his world. He wanted nobody and nothing but the lovely, subtle, responsive vegetation, and himself, his own living self. It was necessary to go back into the world. That was true, but that did not matter, so one knew where one belonged. He knew now where he belonged. This was his place, his marriage place. The world was extraneous. He climbed out of the valley, wondering if he were mad. But if so, he preferred his own madness to the regular sanity. He rejoiced in his own madness. He was free. He did not want that old sanity of the world, which was become so repulsive. He rejoiced in the newfound world of his madness. It was so fresh and delicate, and so satisfying. As for the certain grief he felt at the same time, in his soul, that was only the remains of an old ethic that bade a human being adhere to humanity. But he was weary of the old ethic, of the human being, and of humanity. He loved now the soft, delicate vegetation that was so cool and perfect. He would overlook the old grief. He would put away the old ethic. He would be free in his new state. He was aware of the pain in his head becoming more and more difficult every minute. He was walking now along the road to the nearest station. It was raining and he had no hat. But then plenty of cranks went out nowadays without hats, in the rain. He wondered again how much of his heaviness of heart, a certain depression, was due to fear lest anybody should have seen him naked lying against the vegetation. What a dread he had of mankind, of other people. It amounted almost to horror, to a sort of dream terror, his horror of being observed by some other people. If he were on an island, like Alexander Selkirk, with only the creatures and the trees, he would be free and glad. There would be none of this heaviness, this misgiving. He could love the vegetation and be quite happy and unquestioned by himself. He had better send a note to Hermione. She might trouble about him, and he did not want the onus of this. So at the station, he wrote saying, "I will go on to town. I don't want to come back to Bruttleby for the present. But it is quite all right. I don't want you to mind having biffed me in the least. Tell the others it is just one of my moods. You were quite right to biff me because I know you wanted to. So there's the end of it." In the train, however, he felt ill. Every motion was insufferable pain, and he was sick. He dragged himself from the station into a cab, feeling his way step by step, like a blind man, and held up only by a dim will. For a week or two he was ill, but he did not let Hermione know, and she thought he was sulking. There was a complete estrangement between them. She became wrapped, abstracted in her conviction of exclusive righteousness. She lived in, and by her own self-esteem, conviction of her own rightness of spirit.
9.
Coal dust. Going home from school in the afternoon, the Brangwen girls descended the hill between the picturesque cottages of Wiley Green till they came to the railway crossing. There they found the gate shut, because the colliery train was rumbling nearer. They could hear the small locomotive panting hoarsely as it advanced with caution between the embankments. The one-legged man in the little signal hut by the road stared out from his security, like a crab from a snail shell. Whilst the two girls waited, Gerald Critch trotted up on a red Arab mare. He rode well and softly, pleased with the delicate quivering of the creature between his knees. And he was very picturesque, at least in Gudrun's eyes, sitting soft and close on the slender red mare, whose long tail flowed on the air. He saluted the two girls and drew up at the crossing to wait for the gate, looking down the railway for the approaching train. In spite of her ironic smile at his picturesqueness, Gudrun liked to look at him. He was well set and easy, his face with its warmth and showed up his whitish, coarse mustache, and his blue eyes were full of sharp light as he watched the distance. The locomotive chuffed slowly between the banks, hidden. The mare did not like it. She began to wince away, as if hurt by the unknown noise. But Gerald pulled her back and held her head to the gate. The sharp blasts of the chuffing engine broke with more and more force on her. The repeated sharp blows of unknown, terrifying noise struck through her till she was rocking with terror. She recoiled like a spring let go, but a glistening, half-smiling look came into Gerald's face. He brought her back again, inevitably. The noise was released. The little locomotive with her clanking steel connecting rod emerged on the high road, clanking sharply. The mare rebounded like a drop of water from hot iron. Ursula and Gudrun pressed back into the hedge in fear. But Gerald was heavy on the mare and forced her back. It seemed as if he sank into her magnetically and could thrust her back against herself. "The fool!" cried Ursula loudly. "Why doesn't he ride away till it's gone by?" Gudrun was looking at him with black-dilated, spellbound eyes. But he sat glistening and obstinate, forcing the wheeling mare, which spun and swerved like a wind, and yet could not get out of the grasp of his will, nor escape from the mad clamor of terror that resounded through her, as the trucks thumped slowly, heavily, horrifying, one after the other, one pursuing the other, over the rails of the crossing. The locomotive, as if wanting to see what could be done, put on the brakes, and back came the trucks rebounding on the iron buffers, striking like horrible cymbals, clashing nearer and nearer in frightful strident concussions. The mare opened her mouth and rose slowly, as if lifted up on a wind of terror. Then suddenly her 4 feet struck out, as she convulsed herself utterly away from the horror. Back she went, and the two girls clung to each other, feeling she must fall backwards on top of him. But he leaned forward, his face shining with fixed amusement, and at last he brought her down, sank her down and was bearing her back to the mark. But as strong as the pressure of his compulsion was the repulsion of her utter terror, throwing her back away from the railway so that she spun round and round on two legs as if she were in the center of some whirlwind. It made Gudrun faint with poignant dizziness, which seemed to penetrate to her heart.
No.